This video is sponsored by Reverb. Click the link in the description to start selling and claim your reward. Hello guys, Colin here. 100 watt guitar amps only generate about 7 decibels more loudness through the same cabinet than a 20 watt amplifier. To our ears, that's not even twice as loud. The bigger difference is a tonal one resulting from a concept called Headroom. As volume increases on both amps, the 20 watt amp will see its signal affected much sooner than the signal from the 100 watt amp, even at similar perceived loudness. The 100 watt amp has more headroom, which protects its signal from power amp corruption for much longer. But what is headroom? Is having a lot of it always useful? And how much of it do we really need? Let's find out. Headroom is a measure of clean amplification. Now, I'm not talking about a clean tone here. Clean and distorted tones are their own thing entirely. I'm talking about how cleanly you can amplify any given tone. For example, it's possible to cleanly amplify a distorted sound. Clean amplification in terms of headroom means that the power amp is not contributing towards the distortion. Distortion in a power amp includes things like compression, sag, and other artifacts which distort the signal, not just clipping, which guitarists more commonly associate with the word distortion. Let's separate from guitar amps for a second to talk about PA amps, as they make it a little bit easier to see the distinctions between these concepts. PA amplifiers have the sole purpose of cleanly amplifying whatever is being fed into them, be it guitars, drums, vocals, or any other signal you wish to amplify. Any power amp distortions in a PA amp will make a complete mess of the resulting sound. Because of this wide range of applications, it's especially important to consider both the peak power and the average power levels when choosing the power of the amplifier. The average power, as the name suggests, is how much power is required to amplify the sound on average for the mean volume level found in the signal being amplified. The peak power is how much power is available to amplify any short, instantaneous volume increases in the signal. The difference between the average power and peak power is the amplifier's headroom. Essentially, how well can the amplifier handle any sudden increases in volume without distorting. Some instruments have a very high peak value. Drums are a perfect example of this. While drums may not be very loud on average, they are extremely loud for very sudden, short periods of time. Trying to amplify drums with a PA amplifier which doesn't have enough headroom will result in very short periods of distortion every time there's a snare hit or a cymbal crash. This can be combated to some extent by using a compressor or limiter. By bringing the levels of these peak volumes down closer to the average volume level, the amplifier doesn't require as much headroom to cleanly amplify the peaks. As a comparison, clean single-coil guitar sounds have a fairly large peak factor as far as guitars go. The initial transients of the notes are very much louder than the rest of the decaying note, so quite often compressors are used in conjunction with single-coil pickups to help eliminate any unwanted distortions. Other instruments have a much lower peak value. That is, there's less difference between the loudest sound and the average sound that the instrument can produce. Violins, flutes, and organs are all far less peaky, and guitars fall into this category too for the most part. To amplify these instruments requires far less headroom than it would to amplify drums or vocals. A PA amplifying to an average sound level of 50 watts may require 800 watts total to achieve enough headroom not to distort the peaks of drums and other high peak instruments. Guitar amplifiers, on the other hand, amplifying to an average sound level of 50 watts, may require only 100 watts total to achieve enough headroom due to the smaller peak factor of guitars. Now, as I said in the low watt amp video, 50 watts average is massively loud, and due to the logarithmic scaling factor between power and volume, 50 watts and 100 watts are practically as loud as each other. You don't need the extra power for more volume, you need the extra power to preserve your tone against power amp distortions. If you are running your 50 watt amp at full volume for an average power level of around 50 watts, then you've left no room for peaks in your sound. Any part of your signal that is louder than the average will become squashed, compressed, and distorted, as there's no headroom left to cleanly amplify any of these peaks. Also, running amps at their extremes like this will start to exhibit voltage sag in the transformers and output valves, as they can't quite handle the signal levels and dip out. All of this is encapsulated under power amp distortion, and it affects your sound tonally. 100 watt amps can drive the speakers to the same volume for an average signal of around 50 watts, but importantly has the headroom to amplify the peaks so that you don't incur any distortion effects from the power amp. So while 100 watt amps can't be observably more loud than a 50 watt amp, they can get to the same volume level while being tonally cleaner. I'm just plucking some common numbers out of the air here, but the rules apply regardless of the power of the amplifiers. And granted, 50 and 100 watts are quite extreme examples. Running your guitar level to an average power of 50 watts in most of today's gigging environments that you're likely to encounter is complete insanity. In fact, your average power is probably going to be far less than 20 watts in most cases, but it does help visualize exactly the choice you need to make when deciding upon the power of your amplifier. It really boils down to whether you do or do not want the effects of the power amp incorporated into your sound. But before I outline the scenarios in which power amp distortion can be a gift or a curse, allow me to say a few words about Reverb, this video's sponsor. No.
Sell them. Sell them all.
No.
Get rid of your pedals. The guitars.
No.
All for sale on a non-specific auction site or marketplace where they won't pitch their true value.
What a terrible dream. Don't live the nightmare of selling your gear through general sales platforms. Instead, choose a site that's specifically tailored to musical equipment, populated by people who know the worth of your guitars, amplifiers, and effects. Reverb is a dedicated marketplace for musicians with millions of members all across the world. They take less of a cut than eBay and offer far greater seller protection than the likes of Gumtree or the dreaded Facebook Marketplace. And as a reward for becoming a new seller on Reverb, they are offering £10 back on your next purchase after you place your first listing. So with spring just arriving, there's no better time to clear out your unwanted equipment to make room for some new stuff. Click on the link in the description to start selling on Reverb and claim your £10 credit. Classic rock benefits from power amp distortion. Exceeding the headroom was part of the way the equipment was being used at the time. So does a lot of blues and metal where pushing the amp hard is part of the sound. This is where deliberately using a low wattage amp to get the power amp distortion point at lower volumes is a real advantage if you're playing small to medium sized venues and can't be loud, or for controlled studio work. It's impossible in these situations to get that tonality out of a 100 watt amplifier, for example, because you can't get it loud enough to defeat its massive headroom. Similarly, if you're being mic'd up and you want to control onstage volume levels, like what will happen at any real music venue, not the floor of your friend's barn, then using low wattage amplifiers you can get the tone of exceeding the headroom at volume levels that your sound engineer and bandmates can handle. You just have to look at Marshall's recent inclusion of 20 watt versions of their classic 100 watt amps as confirmation of this. Those classic amps required to be cranked full to get their iconic tone, so by dropping the power level and by extension the headroom, you can get those tones at much more controllable volume levels, a vital improvement for today's gigging and studio environments. Some situations, however, do not benefit from power amp distortion. If you want to stay pristine, untainted, pure virgin clean, and be very loud with it, then you'll need more watts. Not to be louder, but to be cleaner, to get the volume without the distortion effects. Many older amplifiers were advertised in this way. 30 watts of undistorted sound was the sales pitch for the trusty AC30, and while much of the cleanness of an amplifier comes down to its circuit design, the more watts you have, the more headroom you'll get, and the less likely you'll be to hit that power amp ceiling. Similarly, staying clinically distorted while being very loud, as some extreme tech metal genres require, suffers if power amp sag gets in the way. Higher wattage amps may be required in these scenarios to protect your high gain integrity. Again, not to be louder, but to have null effect on your carefully crafted preamp tone, and to ensure that any peaks in the signal come way below the power amp choking point. Although if you want to go down that specific metal route, then sending the preamp directly to the sound desk with a cabinet sim, or using digital modelling solutions, as many touring metal bands now do, makes use of the front of house sound system's huge headroom, ruling the limitations of guitar amps out of the equation entirely, and ensuring your audience has the best possible sound mix. Speaking of digital modelling and headroom, these setups require particular careful thought and benefit from full-range flat-response speaker cabinets. Normal guitar speakers don't recreate the very high-frequency distortions associated with driving power amps. Guitar speakers have a high-frequency roll-off, meaning that many of the shrill, high-frequency components of power amp distortion are simply ignored by the speaker, and we don't hear them. Full-range flat-response speakers are more than capable of reproducing these high-frequency components. they are full range after all. Therefore, using them with low wattage amps at high volumes can lead to undesirable results. A distorting power amp through an FR speaker will sound terrible, a fizzy, strenuous mess. It's also the reason that playing your amplifier through headphones can often be headache-inducing. A good quality, high power, Class D solid state power amp paired with an FR speaker cabinet is usually the desired solution for this application, as Class D can be made to thousands of watts, giving it plenty of headroom not to distort any of the peaks in the signal while offering the best uncoloured representation of the digitally modelled guitar tone. So to recap, headroom is the difference between average power and peak power in an amplifier. The more you amplify your signal, the less headroom you have, and any peaks in the signal can fall victim to the effects of power amp distortion. Whether power amp distortion is desirable comes down to what style of music you are playing. If you want it, then low power amplifiers will get you there much quicker, and if you don't, high power amplifiers will keep your signal clearer for much longer. Understanding headroom will hopefully allow you to use your existing equipment better, and if you have just discovered that you've bought the wrong thing, then hopefully it will better inform your purchases for the future. And if you've liked this video and you want to see more content from me, then you can hit that subscribe button, which will notify you of all new content as it comes out. My Patreon is also there for exclusive secret stuff. T-shirts are available, and there's other videos that you may not have seen. That's all for now, guys. Keep it loud, and I'll see you later.